Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Demi Mikelau, and I'm the president of the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, or WICHE. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the webcast today. As background, WICHE is a regional interstate higher education compact formed by the Western states in 1953 with the mission of expanding educational access and excellence for all residents of the West. Our region covers 15 Western states, as well as 3 U.S. territories and 3 freely associated states in the Pacific. We advance our mission by promoting innovation, cooperation, resource sharing, and sound public policy. As part of our work in supporting sound public policy in the West, WICHE is producing high school graduate projections at a national level since 1979. Here you see all of the previous covers from these reports, and today we're pleased to release the 11th edition. I'm going to start by giving a little background about this work, which we tend to refer to as knocking for short. When WICHE first produced these projections in June of 1979, it only covered the 13 states that were members of the compact at that point. Based on demand from other states, WICHE produced projections for the rest of the country. I'll quote former WICHE Executive Director Phil Sirotkin, who wrote in the foreword in that very first edition, speaking about forthcoming declines in the traditional aged post-secondary populations. These enrollment factors and the pressures of inflation and constraints on government funds combine to present the most perplexing set of issues to face higher education planners and administrators in a generation. Fast forward to today, and we're releasing this report at a time that isn't altogether different from what Phil described back then. But our current context includes a few new perplexing issues. Post secondary enrollment has been declining. New questions are being raised about the value of post secondary education. And technological advances promise to either save higher education or hasten its doom, or potentially something in the middle. But it's important to remember we have agency. At its core, knocking is a relatively straightforward projection of future numbers of high school graduates at the state level. This has included disaggregations by race for public school students since data were made available for the model starting in the late 1990s. As a tool and resource, it has become incredibly valuable to states, institutions, K-12, and higher education. And in recent years, as the US Department of Education has changed its data reporting structure to focus on graduation rates rather than numbers, knocking has become even more important. There simply is no other report and data resource like it. And other things have changed. Not only have the graphic design elements evolved since the 1970s, but we also are able to share interactive dashboards that will allow you to explore and gain deeper insights into the data relevant to your context. So with that as a quick history lesson, let's move on to acknowledging the folks who made it all happen. On the policy team are Peace Brandsberger, Colleen Falkenstern, and Melissa Sanders, who have run the model, developed the visualizations, and probably most importantly, gathered graduation and enrollment numbers state by state. Melanie Sidwell and her communications team, Joseph Garcia and Bella Ciarico, did amazing work preparing for a major media launch, building an engaging and highly functional website, and helping us put together the high quality report. Jeanette Porter was responsible for ensuring that all the previous editions are available on wiche.edu. And Patrick Lane was the lead author and managed the overall project. We also want to acknowledge Communication Works and Bross Group for their support as well. So thank you to this great team. And our partners who made this effort possible with their generous financial support deserve special recognition, Lumina Foundation and College Board. We're extremely grateful for their longstanding partnership. And finally, we want to thank the state agency staff across the country who worked with our team, providing data and patiently explaining nuances of their state contexts. So with that, let's get started. My colleagues, Dr. Patrick Lane and Ms. Colleen Falkenstern, are going to provide a 30-minute presentation for you. Please feel free to enter questions into the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to get your questions answered. There's a function that you can upvote a question if you have the same question as someone else, and we'll try to acknowledge that. And if we miss you, we'll do our best to follow up with you afterward. Slides and the data, as well as the interactive dashboards, will be available on our website. And please reach out to Dr. Lane with any follow-up, including requests for presentations. So Dr. Lane, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Demi. And before we jump in, I do see a couple of hands raised in the participant section. If you do have a question, go ahead and put that into the chat box. And if not, we'll just carry on. And one other point as we get going, if you do have questions as we go about specific data points or clarifications about the data, Please put those into the chat box. We'll do our best to stop as we're going along and address those. But sort of the bigger, more or deeper questions we'll save for the end. So with that as introduction, let's get to the data. The first key takeaway is that the number of high school graduates is projected to decline from the class of 2025 through the end of our projections in 2041. And here's what that looks like in graphical form. And I'll walk you through the slide a little bit. The line on top is the grand total, and where it's darker, 2008 through 23, the data are the actuals reported by the states and the federal government, and the actual number of high school graduates. You can see we're somewhere around 3.3, 3.4 million in 2008. And then you move up the line to where it gets lighter in 2024. That's where the projections began. And there we see a peak in 2025 of about 3.9 million before we hit a generally downward trend that takes over basically through the end of the projections. There are a few upward blips, but it's fairly consistent, ending at about 3.37 million graduates in 2041. The blue line below the black line is for public high school graduates, and the greenish line at the bottom represents private school graduates. And obviously, high school enrollment across the country is predominantly in public schools. So that trend line is predominantly affected by two major factors. The first is the number of births 18 years earlier. And you can see here two lines. The top one is the total number of births from 2000 to 2023. And the lower line is the federally reported fertility rate, measured as the number of births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 44. You can see those two move fairly close together. And if we were to scroll back to the previous slide, you would see that the trend lines match up pretty closely. The other key factor is the rate at which students progress through the K-12 system. We don't have a single measure of that, but as a rough proxy, you can think about high school graduation rates, which are shown here. These are the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rates reported by the federal government. At a national level, they've trended upwards in recent years, but then leveled off in the last couple of years. And it's essential to understand that what we project are the number of graduates. So the rate is related, but it's not the same. You could, for example, have more graduates even as rates fall if the incoming cohorts are larger. And like many states have in recent years, you could have declining numbers of graduates even as you have increasing rates. Other factors obviously affect the numbers too, including net migration and mortality. So here you can see how it plays out. On this slide, the bottom line is the same as the earlier chart, showing current and projected number of graduates with the year on the bottom axis. You can see in general, they have moved relatively consistently with the number of births, which is on the top line, referring to the birth year, which is on the axis at the top. At the very early side of the chart on the left of your screen, you can see where there were declining births in the late 1990s, but rising high school graduate numbers at the outset of the chart in 2010. This is a period where school districts had made substantial progress on high school graduation rates, again, as a rough proxy for overall completion of the system, and they were essentially becoming more efficient. And that sort of difference before they start moving in lockstep is really, as a little bit of foreshadowing, important for the broader argument we'll make at the end, that the demography we're presenting is not locking higher ed into a awful future. So now I will turn it over to Colleen Falkenstern. She's, as Demi mentioned, senior research analyst, and she'll walk through some of the other findings.
Thanks, Pat. So looking at the second key finding from the report, it looks at the underlying data for public high school graduates by race and ethnicity. And so although the total number of high school graduates is projected to decline, the number of Hispanic or multiracial high school graduates is projected to increase over the course of the projections, at the same time that all other populations by race and ethnicity are expected to decline. These underlying demographic shifts are not new to this edition and has been an ongoing trend since the inclusion of race ethnicity in these projections in the 1990s. Before I dig in a little bit more detail on the high school graduates by race ethnicity, I just want to note that the high school graduates by race ethnicity are just for public high school graduates and not including private high school graduates due to data limitations. And I'd also note that we use the federal definition of race and ethnicity, meaning that all graduates who have Hispanic origin will be included in the Hispanic graduate count. All graduates who have more than one race and non-Hispanic would be in the multiracial or two or more race population. And all high school graduates from all other populations, by definition, would be single race and non-Hispanic. So digging into these data, this chart displays the U.S. high school graduates by race and ethnicity. The white public high school graduates, the blue section on the bottom, represents the largest public graduating population and expected to move from about 1.6 million high school graduates in current classes, which is about 47% of the total, to about 1.2 million high school graduates by 2041, which will be under 40% of public high school graduating classes during that time. The green section includes Hispanic public high school graduates, and that is expected to move from around 940,000 high school graduates in 2023 to around 1.1 million high school graduates in 2041, which would be about 36% of the total. Black public high school graduates are expected to decline by over 100,000 from around 480,000 in 2023 to 373 in 2041. Asian and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander high school graduates are expected to decrease from nearly 218,000 to about 197,000 over the course of the projections. And as stated previously, the number of multiracial high school graduates is expected to increase over the course of the projections from around 127,000 to just over 214,000, which means that it's expected by 2041 that multiracial high school graduates will be the fourth largest population of public high school graduates and about 7% of the total. The number of American Indian Alaska Native high school graduates is projected to decrease from nearly 30,000 to just under 18,000 in 2041. And now we'll take a look at what this looks like in percentage change terms. So this chart highlights the variation in trends by student population from the class of 2023. As stated already, graduates of two or more races or multiracial graduates are projected to increase by about 68% over the course of the projections, and high school graduates are expected to increase by about 16% over the course of the projections. Two things to note about these increases. When looking at births in recent years, the number of multiracial and Hispanic babies born annually has increased while all other populations have decreased. And as Pat has mentioned, that's the births will really drive the long-term trends in these high school graduate projections. Something to note about the Asian and Native Hawaiian other Pacific Islander population, which is projected to decrease by about 10% over the course of the projection. Due to data limitations in the births data, we can only report separate counts of Asian and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander graduates through the class of 2034, but we do use a combined total over the entire course of these projections. And as you can see, the Asian population represents over 90% of this combined total, and the trend follows very closely through 2034. In the 2020 edition of the Knocking at the College Door report, the Asian, Native Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islander high school graduates were expected to continue to increase at the end of the projections. But between the past 5 to 6 years, declines in Asian and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander births have been much steeper than the nation and other populations, driving a decline over the course of these projections. Black public high school graduates are projected to decline by about 22%, and white public high school graduates are projected to decline by about 26%. Lastly, American Indian Alaska Native population graduates are expected to decline by about 41% over the course of these projections. And something to note about the American Indian Alaska Native population is that these data reflect only those American Indian Alaska Native population enrolled in public schools and is not able to include those enrolled in Bureau of Education schools. From the limited data we were able to collect, that would add in about 5% more American Indian Alaska Native high school graduates to the national total. And additionally, we know that by looking at other data sources, such as the US Census Bureau, is that those who identify as American Indian Alaska Native are more likely to be of multi-race identity or Hispanic origin. And so I'm going to break that down just a little bit on this next chart. So given that increase that we're expecting over multiracial high school graduates over the next 15 years, we looked at census data to better understand this population and provide context to the projections that we provide. So there's two key things to take away from this chart. The first being that the multiracial population described in our education data systems and that were used to create these projections is extremely diverse within itself. And additionally, among the racial populations, there are some populations that are more impacted by a more narrowly defined race and ethnicity categories. For example, if you look at the American Indian Alaska Native bar on this chart, which is going to include all of those who identify as American Indian Alaska Native, regardless of their races or in combination or Hispanic origin, you see that just 25% are non-Hispanic and American Indian Alaska Native alone, which reflects the data, education data that we have on American Indian Alaska Native populations. And 38% are non-Hispanic and multiracial, which would be included in the multiracial or two or more races population in our projections. And 38% are of Hispanic origin, which would be included in the Hispanic population in our projections. So another population that is heavily impacted by this is the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander population, which has just 29% from census of those who identify as Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander do so alone and of non-Hispanic origin. So with these two smaller populations that are expected to decrease over the projections that we have for them, with a broader definition of race and ethnicity would be much larger in numbers. And so now looking ahead to the next key trend of the report, and this is looking at the variation across regions and states across the country, and I think would be of most interest to people on here as everyone kind of looks within their own context at these projections. The key takeaway from looking at the regional data shows that the South, the largest number of high school graduates come from the South, is expected to increase, while the West, the Midwest, and Northeast are expected to have steeper declines in coming years. This chart highlights that variation as the South, which has long been the largest region in terms of high school graduates and has been increasing over the past decade, is expected to continue to increase from about 1.4 million to 1.5 million high school graduates. The West, which when compared to projections from 2020, is expected to have steeper declines than previously projected. The region is expected to go from around 934,000 to 745,000 over the course of these projections. The Midwest has remained relatively flat in numbers of high school graduates over the past decade and is expected to decline from around 768,000 to 639,000. And the Northeast, which has been experiencing a decline in high school graduates for the past decade, is projected to decline from around 612 to 518,000 high school graduates. And so looking in with a little more detail, starting with the West region. Overall, the number of high school graduates in the West is expected to decrease by about 20% over the course of the projections, which is around 188,000 fewer graduates. And although the region is expected to see a nearly doubling in the number of two or more race or multiracial high school graduates by 2041 and a modest 2% increase in private high school graduates, it's not enough to offset declines expected across all other race and ethnicity populations. And looking at the states in the region, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota are all projected to see increases in the number of high school graduates. There are noticeable declines projected in Hawaii and California. Noticeably about California and the impact on the overall regional trend is if you were to exclude California from the region, the decline overall would be about 10% over the course of the projections. Additionally, New Mexico, Oregon, Alaska, Wyoming, and Colorado are all expected to have projected double-digit decreases over the course of these projections. Now looking at the southern region. In the South, there's expected to be increases in multiracial and two or more race graduates, Hispanic, as well as Asian and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander high school graduates. The South is the only region across the country expected to see an increase in Asian and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander high school graduates. They are also expected to see an overall increase in private high school graduates. There's wide variation in the region in terms of states, as well as the District of Columbia and the projected increase, from a 31% increase in DC, which is the smallest number of high school graduates, and as well as large increases in Tennessee, Florida, and South Carolina, all expected to see double-digit increases. On the other hand, Maryland, Mississippi, and West Virginia are projected to see double-digit declines over the course of these projections. Moving to the Midwest region, which is expected to decrease by about 16% or 120,000 fewer high school graduates, the region is projected to see increases among their Hispanic and multiracial populations, both at about a 26% increase. This includes also additionally, there's decreases across all other populations, as well as an 18% decrease among the private high school graduates in the Midwest. Every state in the region is expected to see a projected decline over the course of these projections, ranging from a 32% decrease in the largest state in the region, Illinois, and 20% decrease in one of their larger states, Michigan. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Missouri, and Kansas and Indiana are also expected to see double-digit declines between 10 and 15%, while Ohio, Nebraska, and Iowa are expected to see declines fewer than 6%. And lastly, looking at the Northeast region. Overall, the region is expected to see a 17% decline in high school graduates. They are expected to see projected increases in multiracial and Hispanic high school graduates, but not enough to offset declines among white, Black, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, and private graduates. Similar to the Midwest, every state in the Northeast is projected to decline, with the largest declines expected in New York, followed by Pennsylvania with a 17% decline. New Jersey is the state that's expected to see the smallest decline over the course of the projections at just a 1% decline. And so I'm going to just highlight, as Demi mentioned, we have a suite of data visualizations on our website that really allow you to dig into the variation across the states and look through the lens of your own context. The first one being our data profiles, which follows along with the report and provides similar charts for each state, region, or the nation throughout this dashboard. We also have a series of key findings dashboards that look a little bit closer at some of the key findings we're discussing in this presentation and allow you to look across all states at a single view. And lastly, we have a data visualization that allows you to pick a state or states and create charts such as the top line numbers of high school graduates for each population, select the years that you would like. You can also add more than one state to see states side by side in terms of their trends of high school graduates. So we encourage you to explore the data visualizations. Please reach out if you have any questions on the functionality or ways to access this information. And I'll turn it back over to Pat to discuss the next key finding.
Thanks, Colleen. We do see the questions coming into the chat. I think most of them at this point we'll be able to get to at the end. There have been a couple that seem like straightforward clarifications, but because nothing's complicated or nothing's easy in the data world, they will take a little bit of explanation. So we'll get to them at the end. The last of our major takeaways relates to the impact of COVID. And for those of you that were here with us 4 years ago, you remember that the data in the last edition ended with the class of 2019. Even though it was released in 2020. So a key unanswered question was what impact the pandemic would have. We've put out a couple of supplementary briefs looking at this over the last few years, but it really was a key unanswered question. And what we find in the data is a modest suggestion of a slightly steeper decline than we previously projected. But if you think back to 2020, it's certainly not as bad as it could have been. But I want to be clear first that we did make a minor adjustment to our model that was based on what we saw in the data. And without going too far into the weeds, although I'm happy to answer this in more detail later or point you to the technical appendix, which I think has been shared in the chat. The model is based on a weighted average of 5 progression rates for the previous 5 years. And what we saw is, in particular, the 2020-2021 school year had noticeably lower progression rates from the previous year. But then for the most part, though not exclusively, the rates picked back up. So we looked at the data and looked at our history, and we have in the past made slight adjustments to the model. For example, when race ethnicity definitions were changed by the feds to smooth out some of these bumps. So what we did is look at some different approaches to handle this anomaly and ended up picking one that showed the closest adherence to our regular standard model using historical non-COVID data. And note there that we did not try to pick a model that got us closest to the truth, as far as there is truth in projections, but really what sticks closest to the standard model because we've evaluated that and trust it. The impact of the adjustment was meaningful. Depending on the data point, it raises projections somewhere around 4%. But we think it's a very reasonable and data-driven adjustment. Again, happy to discuss it in more detail with folks that want to wade into the methodology, or I would point you to the technical appendix, which has more detail on it. But so here's a comparison between the numbers in our previous edition and this one. What we see is that they're pretty darn close to each other. You can see a little bit of daylight between the blue line, which represents the 2020 projections, and the 2024 edition in green. While this is a relatively small percentage difference of somewhere around 1 to 1.5%, depending on the data point, Over time, it amounts to about 750,000 fewer graduates through 2037. Again, that's roughly between 1% and 2%. Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent for a global pandemic, we don't know. We'll have to wait till the next one so we can compare it to something. But I think really, if you forced us to make a conclusion, we'd say that's certainly not as bad as it could have been. And this chart is drawn from the report and looks at the differences in grade-by-grade enrollments rather than graduates. The blue bars that are slightly hidden behind the green ones show the 2020 projections, and the green bars in front show the total for the actual data reported in 2023 that is published in this edition, again for the 2022-23 school year, excuse me. You can see the total enrollment for elementary school is off by about 1.5%. And the same is true for high school, middle school slightly less. And then if you look on the right side of the slide, you can see the grade by grade differences. Certainly it's not nothing, but if, again, if you're forced us to give an assessment, I think what we keep coming back to is there's something there, but it's not as bad as it could have been. I think where we're more concerned as far as the pandemic impacts go is on two other key impacts: learning loss and chronic absenteeism. I think everybody's seen the research on learning loss and the types of students it seems to be impacting most. Same is true for chronic absenteeism. And I think our concern going forward is, do those factors lead to declining high school graduation rates, which would then depress the actuals below what our projections have been? And that goes back to the rates versus numbers discussion. We can't really project those into the model too easily, but I think that will be a really big challenge for higher ed going forward and something that we'll have to collectively work on to mitigate. So that's the snapshot of the data. Now we'll talk quickly about some of the implications and what that means before getting to your questions. But why do we care? At WICHE, Demi talked a little bit about our mission, and we're really focused on benefits to the residents of the West, but also how higher education can strengthen the civic, social, and economic components of our states and our region. And what we see right now are workforce shortages virtually everywhere we look. And these are just headlines I've grabbed by looking at different industries and different occupations. So we're not trying to say higher ed needs to make adjustments and higher ed needs to improve for higher ed's sake on its own. It's because of the value that higher ed drives to our region and really to states across the country. And I think it's important to recognize here that the occupations that higher ed is producing, it's not just the ones that end up in the mainstream media. Certainly nurses and teachers have gotten a lot of coverage, but diesel technicians, incredibly important in many states in the West. We see shortages there. People graduating with agriculture science degrees, hugely important to our food supply, hugely important to many of the economies in the West and the Midwest. Again, shortages there. So I think some of those stories don't always get told in the mainstream media, but they're definitely important for us, and that definitely underpins what we are thinking about. So then we, of course, move to what we can do. I think we've tried to make the point throughout this report and throughout our discussions with the media, and we are intentionally making it now. As Demi said, higher ed has some agency. There are things that we can do. There are promising approaches, data-driven policy interventions and practice changes that have strong results, and not just that, but good cost-benefit analyses. So we think that we can help higher ed if we act collectively to produce more of the needed credentials and degrees that our economy and our society so desperately needs. In the report, and this was mainly a thought experiment rather than true policy analysis, we did the math on what a slow and steady improvement in the immediate college going rate would mean. What we can show, and this was not highly complicated by any stretch, is that a 5 percentage point annual increase in the college going rate of recent high school graduates would more than offset the decline in high school graduates. Certainly, these would have to be new enrollees and not borrowing from those that might be likely to enroll later, but the math checks out. And this is less about saying what we need to focus on is improving the college going rate by 0.5 percentage point every year, and more to just emphasize that if we do improve the college going rate, that can help offset the decline. The good news is that previously, if you look back over time, we have made progress on this scale over a sustained period of time. So it's not crazy to think of improvements on that scale. The bad news is that the current trend lines are headed the wrong way. So we tend to think even substantial intervention, the best we might do is sort of turn that trend line to a flat instead of trending downward. The other part of the equation could be improving progress once we're into post-secondary education, improving completion rates, improving progression and retention. And here it's a little bit more of a good news story in that there has been progress in recent years. And then the other good news is that every day we all wake up to a world where the higher ed community has better data and better research on what works than at any point in our modern history. Our data systems are by no means perfect, but are definitely improving, and they can help us understand what's working and what's not. And crucially, what's working in our specific contexts, because we know that state contexts and institutional contexts are incredibly different. On this slide here is a reference to the CUNY ASAP ACE program, which I'm sure folks have heard about. It's been replicated elsewhere and continues to spread. The Montana 10 program has components of it. It's been replicated in Ohio. And our colleagues at SHIO are putting together a learning community to help disseminate this and spread its implementation elsewhere. I think what's important to recognize is that there are a series of programs within ASAP and ACE that have strong evidence behind them. And yes, they cost money and it is a substantial investment, but the good news is the research suggests that it pays off. Financial assistance, block scheduling, transportation subsidies, enhanced advising, and really better and more timely use of data are showing to make a difference. Here you see a couple direct admissions programs. I picked Idaho because they were certainly one of the first, and put South Dakota up there as well. And the early research on these is also very promising. The good news is also that they're pretty cost effective. Students get a letter based on their high school performance that lets them know about the institutions that they would be admitted to. It's relatively low cost, and the early research is showing that it is making some progress on enrollment into post-secondary, but at the same time, there are some mixed results on impact for different types of students. So further research and refinement is necessary. And then the other intervention up there comes from one of those sort of dry working papers that's out there, but it's an experiment that was fairly simple. It was just about informing students with more clarity about what financial aid they would be likely to receive if they were admitted. So essentially not changing their financial award, just letting them know earlier in the process and providing more clarity. And what they found is that, yes, that makes a big difference, and that students that get clear and more concise information earlier in the process are then more likely to enroll. Three more approaches here. The first two are where we've had some involvement. You see a thumbnail of a report we did with the Council for Adult and Experiential Learners. Part of what we haven't talked about today, but we could have a whole separate webinar on, is adult learners. That has to be part of the strategy, and finding the appropriate pathways for them is essential. And our research with CALE showed that one particular adult-friendly practice, granting prior learning assessment credit for what adults may already know, and this can apply to traditional age students as well, it makes a big difference. It improves their completion rates, it improves their retention. And on the business side, for institutions that may be concerned that they are quote unquote giving credits away, what the data show is that the opposite's true, that adults who receive this credit are more likely to stay at your institution and keep paying tuition as they progress towards completion. So it's essentially a intervention with a positive cost benefit. The other one is Z Degrees. I think this one's from the Northern Virginia Community College. But as a concept, they're growing. These are degrees where courses only use openly licensed course material. We don't think necessarily that should be implemented across the board, but students should certainly have options, especially when you look at the impact of the cost of course materials on a total bill for a student. There are more and more openly licensed materials available. They can be culturally responsive. They're high quality. They're adaptable. And we have some research that's forthcoming. It was just accepted for publication, showing that the usage of open materials is associated with improved completion, particularly for low-income students. And the last initiative up there that I was going to talk about today is from Oregon, where they have benefit navigators to connect students with state and federal benefit programs for which they're eligible. Too many students are leaving money on the table, and we certainly can look at those opportunities and see how it can help students address some of the financial pressures that may lead them to stop out. Some of the pilot work in Oregon that they built on to build a much broader program showed that it improved completion substantially, resulting in positive benefits for the institution on top of completion rates. So what's next? Coming soon. More knocking data. We can't get enough data even after this. One of our first priorities will be to look at the U.S. territories and freely associated states. The freely associated states are actually 3 independent countries in the Pacific, Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, that participate in U.S. education programs. We had some data for those jurisdictions, but given the COVID impacts, it was a little too volatile to push out, so we'll be doing some more analysis on that. We're also going to put together an analysis based on gender, looking at how both the pandemic and just the overall demographic trends around graduation rate may be different for men and women. Last up there is, I talked a little bit about those policy interventions. We're not intending to talk too much about them today, but we are going to look to host a webinar series over the next year or so, just continuing to highlight some of these approaches. And I haven't run this by our comms department yet, but the title I put up there was Scaling the Cliff, with the cliff crossed out, because that metaphor, as people who know cliffs living in the West, tends to drive us nuts. I don't know that scaling the slightly downward sloping trend will pass comms muster, but we'll consider it a working title. But we really want to focus on these policy responses to demographic changes and what institutions can do, because there is agency. And I don't know if anyone saw the report this morning. I'm always hesitant to post something I haven't read about, but the folks at Brookings do relatively good work. And they released a report this morning, essentially summarizing a lot of these same programs, talking about the same things. And I promise we actually didn't coordinate it, but maybe we should have. But if you do get a chance to look at that, it is a terrific piece, and it summarizes these and other programs. Again, these programs just scratch the surface, but we tried to focus on ones where there's really good cost-benefit data, because we know that's always going to be an issue. So with that, we will take a pause and we will jump into questions. We do have contact info for myself and for Colleen. We have the website up there. And then there is the opportunity to subscribe to our knocking news list, so you'll get information whenever we do updates. But we'll try to let folks know about those. So with that, I believe I will turn it over to Demi, and you can lead us through questions.
Great. Thanks, Pat. Thank you, Colleen. That was very helpful to walk us through all of that data. We do have some questions that we weren't able to get to in the Q&A box, and so I will do my best to kind of be efficient with this. And I'm sure that our webinar or webcast participants will shoot me emails if I don't get this quite right. If at the end you still feel like your questions are not answered, please don't hesitate to contact us. We'll do our best to follow up with whatever we don't quite get to. So I'm going to start with a question from Laura Zemp, and I started to answer this in the box, but I thought that it actually warranted a little bit more explanation. And she asked, have the comparisons of previous projections been compared to actuals? And she's particularly wondering about how the multiracial population projections ended up looking in the actuals. And we know that the 2 or more races are projected to increase in number at a higher rate than projected in the 10th edition, but I thought maybe it would be worth just talking a little bit more about the 2 or more race category, given the nuances of the data.
Sure, and this may be a little bit of a team answer. We do have a relatively detailed comparison, edition by edition, in the technical appendix. I don't believe that it goes into differences by race and ethnicity, but that is certainly something we could look at. And the 2 or more races category obviously jumps off the page in any presentation or charts or anything you look at. But then I think when we look at all the other data points around this, we see similar numbers. If you look at the census data on marriages between people of different races, they have skyrocketed over the last decade. And if you look at those other data sources, census and other places, you see the growth of this population there. So we confirm it. I think there are very legitimate questions about whether this represents essentially students changing how they identify themselves. And, you know, that's probably true. And I think we're probably getting to more accurate representations of those students' identities, which is really important. I think the data that Colleen shared around what that 2 or more race category may look like, and we actually have a much more exhaustive policy brief on this from a few years ago. There are so many different combinations, but it's crucially important to recognize that just because you may see a small population of Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islanders, or American Indian, Alaska Natives, that doesn't mean that you don't have those students that are being categorized into a different box just because of how we collect data. There are a huge number of multiracial students. It matters for virtually every group. Black and white students identifying together as the largest category of multiracial students. And as she pointed out, particularly for Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islanders, and American Indian, Alaska Natives, it really matters.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to try to lump a couple questions together. We had a couple questions around migration, and I think at its core, our participants are interested in understanding better how we incorporate migration patterns into the projections. And so the kind of sub questions to that are, how closely do the graduation declines track migration trends? And in other words, are states with more outward migration seeing the largest high declines? So those are related. And then also, are these migration assumptions derived from historical data, demographic projection models, or other external sources? And do you apply them uniformly at a national scale, or do they vary? So really some added insights into the migration components.
Sure. So there's good news and bad news to answer that with. The good news is that we do incorporate immigration both at an international level, net immigration into the US, and state-to-state migration into the model. The bad news for answering this question is that it's sort of done magically through the math and the way our model works. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. The model essentially looks at the last 5 years of enrollments and progressions from grades, from one grade to the next, calculates a ratio of that, and then uses a weighted average of those to calculate the next year's. So if you had just a very simple model, you know, of 2 grade levels, 10 students in each grade, and suddenly 5 students migrated in, the model would catch that, and it would say, okay, your progression rate to the next year is 150%. So essentially, immigration and state-to-state migration, which is a key factor in the overall projections and what's happening, it's implicitly baked into the model, so we don't have to use any assessments of migration itself. We did include a chart in the report itself just showing that the net migration into the US declined during COVID. I think that's part of that small decline that we talked about. And then I think the other area where it probably shows up, and looking at some of the supplementary data confirms this, is in the differences we see regionally. Compared to what we projected previously, the South is projected to grow more, and the West, Northeast, and Midwest are projected to decline a little bit. The very precise data person in me would say that's consistent with increased migration to the South. So essentially, the movement of students and their families to the South probably ticked up a little bit in the last 5 years compared to what we projected previously. And we see that when we look at some of the migration data from the census and elsewhere, but we don't bake that in explicitly to the model.
Great, thank you. We have a question about the NCES data, and that is, why is the NCES data so much different? They indicate relatively small declines through 2030, and in fact, many increases.
Sure, and these are the NCES data projections of high school graduates?
That is what I believe he is
Okay.
referring to.
And I think the answer, and I might call in Peace or Colleen if they have more thoughts here. But those projections, I believe, were released in some time ago. The feds have stopped releasing projections, and I think their actuals, I'm just checking our chat thread here, are only through 2012, 2013. So, our old data may have had bigger increases. And I think what we go back to over and over again is that when we look at the other methodologies that have looked at projections and the other research, NCES is one of those methodologies. When our data were sort of apples to apples, talking about the same timeframes and relying on the same actual data, they were always relatively close to each other. And the other big source that we look to is Nathan Grawe, Grawe. If you haven't looked at his stuff and you're interested in this, you definitely should. It's sort of required reading. And his, the overall shape of his projections match what we talk about for high school graduate projections.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to tick off a couple that might be a little easier to answer, if that's okay, and then maybe we'll go to some that will require a little more explanation. And this kind of goes back to our conversation about two or more races and that part of the discussion. Have there been have there been changes in the number of students with unknown, unreported race?
It's a good question. I might defer there to Peace Bransberger or Colleen. I think for the main part, they sort of force categorizations.
Yeah, and I would just add a point of clarification because on one of the slides I did go through from census, I included some other race, which is a category in census, but not in our education data sets. And that was just because we were relying on census data for that. But for the data that we collect, individuals are placed into those categories. So we don't have any data points for high school graduates for an unknown race or ethnic category.
In the census, some other race category is predominantly due to the two-question structure, and most of those individuals select Hispanic as an ethnicity, and then are faced with a race question and click some other race, and that'll be changed, assuming the next round of data definitions for race and ethnicity go through.
Great, thank you. And are there projections for graduate and professional school enrollment?
I don't think anyone does that. I know Nathan Grawe, he's got the undergrad undergrad demand projections. I don't believe anyone is doing graduate school projections.
That was my understanding as well, but figured you knew better than I did. Okay, then I will go to one more that I think is hopefully one we can tick off. Would this data offer an insight into the growth of dual enrollment in the US?
Oh, that's a great question. No, this does not offer much insight at all into dual enrollment. I think it does raise a couple of concerns. One, to the extent institutions are relying on dual enrollment as sort of a way to offset other enrollment declines, which you can see in the data. We could probably put in the chat link the new IPEDS data that was released on dual enrollment. And it shows pretty strong growth, particularly in the two-year sector of high school students as enrolled college students. So to that extent, if there will be fewer high school students, that would, in theory, if everything else holds true, put some downward pressure there. I think next is what this means in the bigger picture. I think dual enrollment is a really promising approach. There are some issues with it, but overall it has shown, I think, the research would suggest at least that it is helping to improve high school completion numbers and also students' progression into post-secondary education. The research I point folks to is really led and driven by a guy named Jason Taylor at the University of Utah. He has a coalition that is sort of working on a number of research questions there. And we think that can be part of the solution, but it really has to be well-structured dual credit that leads to positive post-secondary outcomes rather than getting as many credits as you can while in high school.
Great, thank you. I do want to thank Matt Freeman and Ginger Gossman for sharing Idaho and Texas's information on direct admissions, so thank you. And I will go to Brian Alexander. Have you considered the impact of a massive Trump administration deportation?
We have not. And, to be honest, I think there are a lot of policy ideas floating around, and we are very much sort of boring, nerdy, dyed-in-the-wool data folks. So what we would look to is, are there going to be specific policies, when they would be implemented, and what happens? As I mentioned, our model takes into account previous enrollments. So, to the extent policy changes impact enrollments, they would then be factored into the next edition.
Great, thank you. And this was a question that came in early on, and I noted that we'd answer it live. And that is, has these data taken into consideration potential immigration numbers through 2041?
Sure. So similar to the discussion of the model, immigration numbers are implicitly baked into it. So to the extent the last 5 years of immigration were to hold true for the next 5 years, we would get that piece of it perfect. We saw a lot of fluctuation in COVID. Net immigration dropped, since rebounding. So I think what we'll begin to see over the next couple of years is whether those trends change, and I think that can give us a better sense of I won't say how accurate our projections will be, but how close reality will hew to our projections.
Great, thank you. And Rena, thank you for your comment on NCES having post-baccalaureate enrollment projections. I appreciate that. And Emily Wiseman is asking, has there been any discussion related to the inclusion of homeschool students in the next iteration of this analysis?
Sure. And if she could see our discussion behind the scenes, there was substantial discussion, because I think that was part of the theory and anecdotal information about the pandemic. Is a huge number of people shifted to homeschooling. We tried to get data at a state-by-state level on homeschooling, and Peace and Melissa really did heroic work here. At the end of the day, the data were frankly a mess. Some states collect data, but it may not be comprehensive data, and many states don't collect data, so there wasn't anything we could use. So all we did really is do sort of a literature review of what is everybody finding about homeschooling, and what those experts, and the report has the citations here, and I would recommend looking at those, is that yes, it does seem like there was some movement to homeschooling as part of the pandemic. But no, it doesn't seem to account for all of the sort of disappearance of students that we see in the education numbers. So there's sort of this missing chunk of students that I think we're very concerned about. What has happened to them? What can we do to re-engage them? What's going to how that's going to impact the long-term trends. But homeschooling, I think, is an essential piece of the puzzle, and we'll be working to try to build that into the, or at least provide as much information as we can. I don't know that we'll ever be able to build it into the model.
Great, thank you. Susan Mapp has asked us to share the research on OER materials and completion. So I'm going to ask the team behind the scenes to go ahead and put that in the chat, and I will cross that off the question list if that's okay.
Yeah, I think that one we'll have to email, because it was in the bibliography, it would say forthcoming because it was accepted for publication and is pending. But yeah, if you reach out, we'll be sure to shoot you that.
Okay. That sounds great. And then we also had a request to post the link to the iPads dual enrollment report, and I think that is the team's working on that. So I just wanted to let you know that. Okay, so I'm going to go over to Robert Minton's question. How will this decline in graduates impact high school funding and college tuition? Typically in the US, demand raises cost. Will we see declines in funding for public high schools, and will higher ed adapt and move quickly to reduce staff and other costs to balance revenue with cost? And in addition to birth rate, should peak death rate by generation also be factored in, since so many public schools are funded by local and state taxes? So that there were a couple questions in there, and a few big ones. So I'll
yeah, I think
let you pause on
few
that if you'd
doctoral
like.
dissertations in there. I'll be honest.
Thank you, Robert, for your question.
Yeah, I think those are terrific questions. I'd be happy to talk in detail more about them. I will completely punt on the high school funding question, and I'd be happy to point you to some folks who could probably answer it better. We just do not look at K-12 funding. We are aware that it exists, but that's about it. Thinking about the higher ed side, though, we are trying to be very explicit, very clear, and very forceful that this report in itself and the data that it's showing is not cause to start cutting back at every possible opportunity. Certainly, institutions should be as efficient as possible, should identify ways to best serve their community and the size of their student populations. But what we're trying to drive home over and over again is that there are ways we can offset the decline in high school graduate numbers by improving college access opportunities, by improving college retention and progression. And I think that's not only important, as I tried to say when we're talking, we don't care about that just for higher ed's sake, that we can keep institutions and their programs open. We care about that because our society as a whole needs these credentials. We need more diesel mechanics in Wyoming, to serve their communities. We need folks in North Dakota that know how to operate drones that are becoming essential throughout their economy. So these are the types of programs that don't get talked about in the mainstream media as much, but they're really essential. And that's where we have concerns. But at the same time, as Demi said, I'll just say it again, higher ed has some agency here. There are approaches and there are really some cost-effective approaches that I think we can help offset some of this decline.
Thanks, Pat. And I'm cognizant of the time. We've got about 4 minutes, so I will do my best here. Does this, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to, because I'm not sure what we were referring to there. I would like to know if there is data on the impact of increased functional illiteracy seen in K through 12th graders.
I'll be honest, I don't know the research on that. We'll take that question though and see if we can find anything out and get back to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the insights regarding adult learners to boost, higher ed enrollment. Does WICHE have a perspective about other potential sources of enrollment growth, international students as an example?
I would say we spend less attention on international students and more on students that are not being served right now. I think international students could certainly fill in some of the gap, and I think we've seen some of the reports out recently on new sources of international students, with students from India increasing in particular. But I really think where we have opportunities for improvement are right in our own backyards. In some ways, higher ed, there are questions that Demi mentioned about the value of higher ed. So figuring out how our institutions and our state systems can best serve the students in our backyards is really the best solution to this. There's a huge untapped pool of potential students, miles from our campuses.
Great, thank you. And then the final question, I just wasn't sure if this was entered in when we were at a specific point in the conversation, so I'm going to ask it and maybe you have a good sense. Does this align with a state or region being a net importer or exporter of individuals with post-secondary education? That is brain drain and brain gain.
Sure, that's a terrific question. It's not in here, but I would say it's a huge issue. And I think that, that's something that we've looked at different points in time with some of WICHE's work. I mentioned the Pacific and the Pacific territories, Hawaii as well. Places like that are incredibly concerned about the brain drain. But then we also see it in places like Wyoming, where they're concerned about, frankly, folks moving down to Colorado, where I live. So I think that's a crucial question. It's not dealt with in this report, but it's really something that is definitely important.
Wonderful, thank you. And it looks like we made it through all the questions with a minute to spare, unbelievably. I want to thank everybody who came to the webcast today. We really appreciate your interest in our work. I want to thank the WICHE team for doing a great job, and especially all of our partners who supported this work. And please follow up with any questions that we didn't get answered or questions that you think of after the webcast. And if you are interested in having us do some maybe targeted presentations, or you just want to talk about the data, please don't hesitate to give us a call. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.